Okay, Lindsay, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us the title of your research.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm Lindsay Wilson-Jones, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the Open University Business School, associated with the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership. I'm an exploratory researcher, and that means that I take an exploratory approach to study the everyday realities of nonprofit board leadership, interestingly, from inside the boardroom. My research interest in terms of concepts is shared leadership and teamwork in nonprofit boards. And in the present research setting, that's within a federated structure of a UK charity. So I'm interested in how boards and others beyond the board work together to make sense of leadership and govern in such a structure. It means that I'm looking at the everyday realities of individuals' lives as they go about doing board leadership and what it means for them. My job is then to try and interpret and make sense of these multiple realities. And that's all a little bit tricky right now.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah, that's a really great overview. Thanks. And you've sent through a blog post as well that you did previously, which I'll attach to this recording as well, so people can read a bit more information about
Okay.
about the research. But one of the things that you mentioned in there is this idea of black boxes and boards
Yes.
being black boxes. Could you expand a little bit on what that means?
Well, essentially, a lot of the board research is underdeveloped, taking a qualitative perspective, and much of the previous research, while it is an important body of knowledge, it takes a structural focus. So you've got a situation where the research is carried out from what they call a positivist orientation. So we don't really know what's happening inside the boardroom. But the way this research is set up, my research is from inside the boardroom. So part of that aim is to open the black box of leadership and to ask the questions about, well, what is happening here? What's going on? Rather than being confronted with an external research type of study where you're focusing on structure or perhaps the composition of the board and manipulating variables as to what is the difference if you alter the gender or alter the kind of tasks that the board is responsible for. So from that point of view, it's, for me, it's fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And in terms of your personal interest in it, then, what attracted you to the research area?
To this area.
Yeah.
I think I have to put my hand up and say that a personal experience working in over many decades, I have to say, in top teams, and some successful, hugely successful in both the corporate and the public sector, but also experience of working in a dysfunctional team. And that happened simply because there was a flaw in the structure. So I have an understanding of what it feels like to be part of a very successful team, but also what it feels like when things go badly wrong and the blame game comes onto the table. And of course, my background is in human resources. So HR players always tend to be the peacemakers and the harmonizers. So it puts a lot more pressure on the HR function.
Yeah, and I would say as well that, I mean, from my personal point of view, that personal connection to the research can be really, really beneficial in terms of how you go about doing it, the type of approach that you take, and the type of data that you produce as well.
Yes, no, I think that's fair. The other thing, I suppose, for me to say is that I've spent most of my adult life in South Africa, and much of that time it was around the transition of South Africa to Western democracy, and I worked a lot with informal teams as well as formal teams. And big lessons that I learned from that period is that, I just got so much learning from working with informal structures and working with informal teams as much as the formal structures. So that forms part of the background for me. And in the UK, certainly, non-profit boards leadership has not grown at the same pace as research around corporate boards.
Yeah, and those sort of contexts, those informal contexts that often involve a lot of change. There's something else you mentioned in the blog post about power sharing, and you mentioned the aspects of shared leadership and those kinds of concepts. So I was wondering if you could give us a bit more of a flavour of where the academic contribution might be for the research.
On the academic contribution, my ambition, hope, is that shared leadership is about empowerment, and it's also about sharing purpose and support, social support. But up to now, it's been studied from a positivist orientation. And this has meant that, and mostly coming out of the States, in recent years, there's a bit more coming out of Europe, particularly Denmark. And they're looking at cross-sector studies where it's a little bit from a positive sort of survey approach, but then also supplementing that with some interviews. Now, they've sort of run into some problems, mostly around translation of terms in the survey material. But one of the things that struck me as I reviewed the literature, so over the last 2 or 3 years, is that we have very little about the dynamic nature of shared leadership and also teamwork. Very often what happens with teamwork, because the shared leadership and teamwork, they're different strands of literature, but they do connect. One can bring them together at different points. And one of the key things is that the practice is to use a sort of a traditional hierarchical leadership approach to study things like team, what's happening and what's going on in teams, when in fact it's more appropriate to look at it from a non-traditional form of leadership that's not hierarchical, rather a sort of more embracing horizontal approach to leadership, to try and understand where the dynamics are. So that would be wonderful to be able to make some sort of tiny contribution in that area.
That sounds really interesting to me. Yeah, that sounds like a great combination of 2 different fields really there. So in terms of where you're at the moment, what stage are you at, and
where am I at the moment? Well, I have to refer to my notes here because it's a bit like being in the middle of a fog right now. Okay, so because of the nature of qualitative work, it doesn't necessarily proceed in a linear fashion. So I'm sort of busy doing some data collection, but also analysis. At the moment, I'm working with 3 research settings, 2 local boards and 1 senior management team. I've collected 43 interviews, digitally recorded interviews, and I've observed 6 meetings at different levels across the Federation. As far as data analysis is concerned, I've carried out analysis of 34 interviews and 2 meetings, so I still have a few more to do. So at the moment, working with emerging themes that are coming out and trying to then sort these out in relation to individual transcripts which represent the views of all these individual people. And then the next stage will be, once all the analysis is complete, then to look at these across the data set, and then start to move into the more of an explanatory phase. And that's when I'm looking to a more top-down approach and linking in the concepts, rather than this inductive approach that I'm using at the moment. I'm using a form of thematic analysis informed by IPA.
What's IPA?
Interpretive phenomenological analysis.
Ah, yes, of course, right, yeah.
So I've had some quite interesting findings, as it were, tentative findings at an individual level, but it didn't work at all at a group level. So there's lots of trial and error here, but broadly it's really taking the principles of a thematic analysis approach to the data.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so I guess then, sort of finally, what do you hope to do looking to the future with the research? Have you got any further plans beyond, well, obviously finishing the PhD and then beyond that?
Finishing would be good, Daniel. I think for me, one of the conditions of gaining access was that I would provide certain reports for the federation, and at a national level and at group level. And I think what they're looking for from me is some insights from a sort of practice point of view that could help inform where they could put more effort into, say, recruitment of trustees, particularly in the board. Rather recruitment of volunteers, but particularly in the board. I think that's a difficult situation for this particular organization, getting the right volunteers in the right leadership roles at the right time. So that's a challenge. But also to perhaps add some value to where they could put more emphasis into their learning and development, their training in-house. So that's an aspect from practice. From the theoretical point of view, I think we've just touched on that a little bit in terms of where I'd like to see some contribution. Honestly, as a third-year student, my focus is getting through day to day.
Yeah.
Right now. This project scratches the surface, and I'm very conscious of that. But it's absolutely fascinating for me. And hopefully it's something that I can develop in the future. As one professor said to me not so long ago, "Oh, this is work that can keep you going for 20 years. That's slightly intimidating. But just to really get through the PhD and then take a bit of a review for myself at that stage."
Yeah, brilliant. That sounds really, really good. And then one last thing would be, in terms of if people want to find out a bit more about your research, is it best to get in touch with you through CVSL, or have you got any other ways you'd like people to get in touch?
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to share my research and my ideas. I tend to be quite tentative about what I say, because until it's actually sort of finished and I've got to the stage, it's in this academic world, my own personal experience is that it's terribly uncertain. So I tend to be a bit tentative from that point of view. But I'm very happy to talk about it.